Okay, so a video on another module. This is going to be about the router module, and again, same build setup, documentation available here. Same story about having to download the build when you're not using Browserify. They all use the same boilerplate. So let's get past that. We're also still using the same sales backend, and I've again written a small implementation of this module. Well, as for lines of code, it's quite large, 100 almost, but it's fairly straightforward. So I'm just going to walk you through it. Let's scroll down a bit to the actual router function. So if you're not using Browserify, the module will be available on the router global variable on window. And setting one up works like this. Again, this is all documented, so if this is going too fast or whatever, you can check the documentation. But we pass it some options that are grapnel options, because really the router is based on grapnel, which is a JavaScript router. Right, so just the default grapnel options, like it has push state, hashbang. Just you'll have to check. There's a couple. So those. Then the ones that aren't grapnel are just all of them except for push state in this case. So routes is an object we'll get to in a sec. Controllers is one, and policies is one. They're all hash maps. And then we have three functions we have to define. Success, well, it says right here, success is executed when a route is successfully executed. And you get past the route object, which is one of these, and also the data received from the controller. So whatever this thing returned. We'll get to how this really works. Then fill gets executed if a route fills, obviously, and sync gets executed when a route syncs. Now, what I mean with when a route syncs is that I have this controller thing. The concept behind a controller is that it should collect data for a view in the end. Now, views aren't really part of this framework. This is just the router, but a controller's task is just collecting data. So I'd have a user controller and have a details method on there, and the details method would get the data for one user, and then the list method would get the data for all users. Now I just call these details and list. You can call them whatever, but you have to refer to them like this in a route. So what this says is if I'm routing to user / some ID, use this controller, right? Controller.details, user controller.details. And if we look at the user controller, we'll see that this details function returns a promise that resolves with this object right here, so some fake model. Typically you would get that model from the server, but this is just an example. So yeah, obviously I could use the model created in the last video to get this data. I might actually change that during this video. That's a cool example maybe. So controllers are functions that collect data for a route, I guess. Cool. Now there's one more concept, policies. If you're familiar with sales, you're also probably familiar with policies. Policies are just functions really that in our case we have to return promises that either reject or resolve depending on whether something is truthy or not. So this is logged in promise or policy rather should return a resolving problem resolving promise if the user is logged in, and it should return a rejecting one if the user isn't. You can put some error message in the reject. Yeah. So, and rec is the same object the user controller gets, and you can get params from the splats using that. In a controller, you can also sync using rec. So this is gonna call, if we call rec sync here, this is gonna call the sync method on here, on the router itself. So in here you could check the route, like what route is this, and also get the data that was synced, and then you could propagate that to a view manually. But view is out of scope for this library, so there is no such thing, but it's right at the point where you'd want to pass it to a view as its success. Like you would render here and then you would like re-render here, and then fill, you might want to have some custom logic there because that's not really supposed to happen. That's, yeah. Right, cool. So policies. So this one just checks whether session user, which is just this variable here, whether it's truthy, and resolves if it is and rejects if it's not. What happens if policies don't all resolve? See this array here. If we have one or more than one and one or more don't resolve, this controller doesn't get executed and this success doesn't get executed, obviously, and fill gets executed. Right, in which case reason, like you have this data object, which is kind of the error object, and it will contain a reason property where you can see what caused it. Now, policies are allowed to cause fails, I guess, because you can fail a policy. Controllers shouldn't fail, really. You should never make a controller that rejects. If you don't want the user to be allowed to do something, use a policy for that. But controllers can be async, but they shouldn't really fail unless something is really wrong. Right, cool. So let's see. I just thought of something, but I forgot. What was I gonna say? Not sure. Okay. Let's just run this application. So my SIL server is running. I'll just restart it to be sure. And let's go to localhost 1337. Right, so that's cool. Let's see if the router exists. Yeah, it does. Cool. So let's take a look at the documentation and look at the methods here. Navigate, redirect. Let's take a look at navigate. So, okay, that's pretty straightforward. Router dot navigate. So let's take a look. Let's navigate to list. So /users. Right. Hey, and it's synced also. So as you can see, it locked these two things. So success first. Right, success with the route and the data. So the route was this controller object. And note that it also put this key right here as the route property on this object. So it used to be just controller. Now it's route is this thing right here, and controller is what it already was. So right, and the object is this. At first, you know, at the start log, or success log rather, it's a collection object with first name and ID mock in there. It's an array. Let's take a look at list. So it resolves with collection with one item with ID mock and first name mock. And then when it syncs, so this is the second log with sync. You can see we log sync here, we log success here. In this object, the data is sync mock and ID, well, name and ID are both sync mock. So that happened right here. So as you can see, typically you would bind some event listener to a model and then call this sync method once it's triggered with the new data. So that moves all the logic of collecting and keeping data correct for a view to one place. I think that's really nice. So right, that's it, I think. I mean, a router is a pretty basic concept. I'll just show you a failing policy, I guess, and then a resolving one. So navigate user and then some number, I think it was, or what? Let me check. Oh shoot. Oops. What is up? Oh, it's some. Okay. Oh, right, I'm already on this page now, so I'm going back to a different one. Going back there, right, yeah. So that works. It was, I think it was stuck on a breakpoint or something, I don't know. But yeah. So we're not logged in. We get this reason, policy, and data not logged in here, which is because a policy failed and it rejected with this data. So let's make this policy succeed. To do that, we just need to set session.user to something that is truthy. So session user is true. Now if we navigate to some other route, you'll see that success is executed and sync as well with the route here with policies and stuff like that. The data, so model with first name and ID mock. So if we look at details, it resolves with this model with first name and ID mock. And then when it syncs, it's still the same route, obviously, but the model will be different. It's sync mock this time. So yeah, that's when we get it resolved. Let's set it to false again and see that now when we navigate to some other route, it'll fail again. So yeah. I'm just gonna check if there's anything else, but I don't think so. I mean, there's like one interesting method. There's also redirect you can call, which is another URL to navigate. What this one does is that it replaces the current history element with the new one. So if you press back, you don't actually get to the page you just were. This is useful in some cases. Right. So that's it. I hope this made sense, and tell me what you think.